we are born of nature, and in nature we will die. Oh, and if we don't make it, it's not because we didn't try. No, it's not because we didn't try. They say they will incorporate the world over my dead body, over my dead body, over my dead body, over mine. They have all the money, we have the will, and I would rather be a match than a paper dollar bill. Yes, I would. Yes, I would. They have the guns, all we are is flesh and blood, but we will multiply our numbers and drown them in our flood. Yes, we will. Yes, we will. They say they will incorporate the world over my dead body, over my dead body, over my dead body, over mine. They have all the power, that's what they say, but we will turn those tables, take their power away. Yes, we will. Yes, we will. We will not be dissuaded, and we will not turn around. We will face the barricades, and we will tear them down. Yes, we will. Yes, we will. They say they will incorporate the world over my dead body, over my dead body, over my dead body, over mine. You can call me a fool, that's alright with me. I will live to see this good round world breaking free. Yes, I will. Yes, I will. They say they will incorporate the world over my dead body, over my dead body, over my dead body, over mine. They say they will incorporate the world over my dead body, over my dead body, over my dead body, over mine.
But I'll just start talking about the U.S. blockade on Cuba. So most people here know that Cuba had a revolution in 1959. And before that revolution, the United States basically owned Cuba, or at least all of the important resources in Cuba. It's the same story that happened in Latin America and a lot of other countries around the world. And the conditions for Cubans were terrible. And on top of owning all the natural resources, the United States also used Cuba as this disgusting gambling, prostitution hideaway, where all the famous people like the Rat Pack, Frank Sinatra and everyone would come away. And if you've seen Godfather Part 2, you see them cutting up the cake of Cuba. So they had a revolution in 1959, led by Fidel Castro, and after that revolution, they nationalized all the major industries in Cuba. The United States lost a lot of money overnight. Cuban people gained a lot of resources overnight. Good thing in my opinion, bad thing in the opinion of the United States government, who instantly started attacking Cuba. These were through terrorist operations, through cutting off trade, because previously they had made Cuba dependent on the United States for a sugar trade. And the blockade, I think, started in 1959, but it was officially announced in 1962. So right now, according to the United States government, it is illegal for U.S. companies to trade with Cuba, except in very specific circumstances. And even more than that, the United States government makes it illegal for subsidiaries of U.S. companies to trade with Cuba, and can actually prosecutes and fines companies for trading with Cuba. There was a Canadian man who was put in jail in the United States because he sold water purification tablets to Cuba and then moved to Philadelphia afterwards. He's in jail. If you want to just Google all of the billion-dollar fines that banks pay yearly to the United States for the crime of handling money with Cuban organizations. Any ship that docks in a U.S. port cannot go to Cuba for, I think it's 6 months afterwards. That makes it, if you're a ship and you're a commercial enterprise, are you going to choose between a country of 11.5 million or a country of 330 million? The U.S. blockade on Cuba targets Cuba. It tries to make the Cuban people weak. It targets the most vulnerable, which are children, older people, sick people. Over 90% of the new medicines that are created in the world are made by US subsidiary companies. Cuba, it is illegal for Cuba to buy those medicines. Children undergoing chemotherapy in Cuba vomit at least 10 to 15 times a day because the medicine against vomiting is made by a US subsidiary company and therefore is illegal for them to have. It is a cruel, inhumane, insane policy perpetrated by a government of the United States of America. And the Cuban people know very well that this is the government of the United States of America, not the people of the United States of America. So that blockade has been going on for over 50 years. And the Passage for Peace caravan to Cuba started in the early 90s when the Soviet Union fell and Cuba lost literally 90% of its trade overnight. Canada has about 80% of its trade with the United States government right now, with companies in the United States right now. And trying to think of what the economy of Canada would be like without that trade overnight is unfathomable. How an underdeveloped country who is blockaded loses 90% of its trade overnight, how it survives is incredible. The average Cuban person lost 20 pounds during the 90s. They called it a special period because things were that desperate. And instead of trying to help the Cuban people, the United States increased the blockade, made it harder for them to get access to food, harder to get access to medicine. And the Reverend Lucius Walker, who had been involved in Passage for Peace, the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, and other solidarity projects for a long time before that. He's a contemporary of Martin Luther King Jr., saw what was happening in Cuba and decided to organize a caravan bringing aid. At first it was just powdered milk, Bibles, but it was an expression of the solidarity of the United States people for the people of Cuba. You'll see videos and pictures from that first caravan in the 90s of these priests trying to bring powdered milk across the border to Cuba on the US-Mexico border and getting the crap kicked out of them by these border officers. But guess what? There was video cameras there, and that made the news. And that started a big fuss because this policy, this inhumane policy the United States government has been trying to keep under wraps for the past 50 years was coming to light. They were forced to let the aid through that year, and they've been forced to let the aid through for the past 24 years. And it's incredible because the Passage for Peace Caravan to Cuba isn't sponsored by any huge organization. It isn't getting money from huge corporations. It's a grassroots community initiative organized across North America and across the world. And Seattle's been a big part of that for a long time. So the Passage for Peace Caravan to Cuba is a really important initiative because what Reverend Lucius Walker said is it's a win-win situation. We win if they try and stop the aid from crossing the border because it publicizes the blockade. And the more people that know about the US blockade on Cuba, especially in the United States, the faster it's going to end because nobody will accept it. It's insane. The second thing, if we get the aid through, we're bringing tons of aid to a country that's blockaded. We're bringing foods, medicines, vehicles that are really necessary. And the motto that the Reverend Lucius Walker said is that if there's a law against loving my neighbor, I want to break it. And I think that's a very good motto, and it's something that the caravan has put forth for the past 2 decades, and that we continued again this year. So I just want to say that the United Nations is in session right now, and Cuba is again presenting a motion against the blockade on Cuba. It's been 2 decades that the United Nations has voted overwhelmingly against the US blockade on Cuba. The only countries that still vote in favor of the blockade are the United States, Israel, who has trade with Cuba, and the Marshall Islands, which is per capita receives more foreign aid than Israel because it's such a small island. It's basically a US military base. The rest of the world is united against the blockade on Cuba. Even the government of Canada, with all of the insane, terrible policies it has that are similar to the United States policies, they just have less money and less weapons to do it with, votes against the blockade every year. That's how crazy the blockade is. So people around the United States, Canada, have been uniting against the blockade through the Passage for Peace Caravan for Cuba for over 20 years. This was the 24th caravan to Cuba. So I'm gonna talk about the border crossing that we did from the Canada into the United States. Then we went to Mexico. Aaron's gonna take it over in Cuba, and then I'm gonna come back and wrap up with hopefully some profound wisdom comments about the blockade in Cuba. But the way we start every caravan, at least in the Pacific Northwest, is we have a picnic and everybody gets together at the Peace Arch border crossing. People from the US, people from Canada get together. We have a big potluck, much like this, except for there's watermelon too because it's the summer. And we get together, all the caravanistas talk about why they're going on the Passage for Peace caravan to Cuba. And people like Hap from Seattle talk about, actually he's reading poetry off his iPhone here, talk about why the caravan is important. And it's a really great place because you have all the border traffic going by on the Peace Arch border crossing, and we've got big signs against the blockade on Cuba. So we have our picnic, and then everybody gets together and marches forward towards the border crossing, which is over here, Peace Arch over here, humanitarian aid over here. It's really neat because, like I said, the cars are just parked. They got nothing else to do but watch us and listen to what we have to say. And of course, we have a lot to say to them about the U.S. blockade on Cuba. This year, when we approached the border, these border guards came up and said, "You guys have to get off this grassy knoll here or we're going to arrest you." We've been on that grassy knoll before. They've never made that same threat. Last year, they tried to stop the aid for 2 days. They refused to let our humanitarian aid through. But we had a 48-hour continuous protest and made them get the aid through. This year, they said, "You guys can come through there, but the people here that are accompanying you cannot stand here or we're going to arrest you." So it turns out if we just stepped about 10 feet back around the other side of the road, we could still do what we wanted. We did that, went inside the border offices, and I've never been asked such crazy questions in my life. They went through every single thing in every single bag. They had to look at our Cuban flags too. And asked us just questions that made no sense, tried to intimidate us, tried to confuse us, but it's simple. We're going to Cuba with humanitarian aid. It's our right as human beings to do this, and we're going to do it regardless of what you guys say. So that took about an hour and a half. The other thing is, the longer we're in there, the longer there's people standing on this grassy knoll chanting against the blockade on Cuba, the more cars are being educated about the blockade on Cuba. And that's a nice artistic photo of Hap speaking at the border. So he's on the knoll talking about the blockade on Cuba. So after an hour and a half, we made it over the border. So that is people taking a photo from the grassy knoll. And that's us across the border, very, very happy. Woo! And then that's the role reversal. That's where we were standing, and that's where the grassy knoll people were. So we made it over the border. We're happy. The humanitarian aid is going to Cuba again for the 21st time on the Passage for Peace caravan to Cuba. So after this, we all boarded a flight and went to Mexico City. We stayed at Judy's house before that. Oh, we celebrated after that too. And that's a really good thing, is that the caravan brings people together. I would have never met most of these people that hadn't been for the caravan. And the unity that it shows, despite borders, despite blockades, despite everything, that we're united and we've got this common project and we're going to see it through, is something the caravan really, really exemplifies. So we celebrated, and then we went to Mexico. Into Mexico, we had a protest as part of the caravan in front of the U.S. Embassy in Mexico. It was raining like crazy, but there was still 700 people there in front of the U.S. Embassy protesting the blockade on Cuba. This guy was on stilts in a big Cuba uniform, and my BlackBerry camera wasn't good enough to get the total length of what he was doing, but it was awesome. So if you've never been to the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, you will see that it's basically caged in. And I thought this cage was temporary because of the protest, but then I realized that this cage is around the U.S. Embassy in Mexico permanently. And these are yellow ribbons that activists in Mexico City put on that cage this month as part of the Yellow Ribbon campaign for the freedom of the Cuban Five. So I kind of liked it because the U.S. is trying to blockade Cuba, but they have to put up their own blockades around themselves because people are so unhappy with everything they're doing. And they had some really big ribbons on the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, which I thought were awesome. So I'm going to stop right now because from Mexico City, we fly to Cuba and go to Santiago in the east. Aaron's going to talk about that, and then I will return. But thank you very much for your attention so far.
As was mentioned earlier, my name is Aaron Mercredi. I work with Vancouver Communities in Solidarity with Cuba, and I joined Thomas and Tamara, who's not here right now, for this year's caravan. So picking up where Thomas left off, we flew to Cuba, spent some time in Havana, and then immediately went to Santiago de Cuba on the eastern side of the island. This was unique for the caravan because it's the first time that Pastors for Peace has gone to that part of the island. And it was very special for us because of the very important history that Santiago de Cuba plays in the Cuban Revolution, as well as the huge, diverse culture that exists in that city, the vibrant atmosphere, but also the current hurricane reconstruction efforts right now are centered in Santiago. So in coming to Santiago, we were immersed in history. One of the first things we did was we went to see Jose Marti's tomb at a cemetery in Santiago. Basically what this is the changing of the guard ceremony at the Jose Marti tomb. It was very special for us to see this. This didn't just happen for us. We found out that this took place every half an hour, that these guards were going back and forth. And as part of this tour, we placed a special wreath on Jose Marti's tomb within there. So that was us just getting into Santiago and visiting the Jose Marti tomb. This is the view from the top of the steps. And basically Jose Marti's figure within Cuba and within Cuban history is that he's seen as the father of Cuba. He was a freedom fighter, he was a writer, he led the fight against the Spanish, but he also warned the Cuban people of the threat of the United States to the north trying to annex Cuba. And within Cuba today, Jose Marti's words, his ideas, are matched with Fidel's ideas, are matched with Raul Castro's ideas, and help steer the ideology of the country. Another thing that we were able to see when we were there is a museum in Siboney. And basically what this is in 1953, young Cuban revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro organized and planned an attack on the Moncada Army garrison located in Santiago. And it was hoped that this attack would spark, they would be able to gain the munitions, gain the firepower, and also gain the confidence of the Cuban people to rise up against the Batista regime. This house is where it was all planned. More than 160 young people from across Cuba, and especially in Santiago, gathered in here in secret and planned this attack on Moncada. And we can go through some of the slides to show that they bought this farmhouse and claimed that they were growing chickens. Behind this chicken coop, they held vehicles, they held munitions, and in some of the areas surrounding the house, in wells, they were storing guns, and basically they held the facade that they were just farmers. And these are just bullet holes that were left in the farmhouse after the failed attack on Moncada. So here's some of the caravanistas just learning more about the history and some of the people involved in the attack and the planning. Which brings us to Moncada itself. The next place we visited was the Moncada Army garrison. This is where the attack took place. This attack was a failure. Of the 160 people who took part in the attack on Moncada, most of them were tortured and killed. A few survived and were able to escape. Like Fidel escaped, Raul escaped, Juan Almeida escaped, and a number of other people escaped, but majority of them were tortured and killed by Batista's henchmen. So we walked through this museum, looking at different aspects of the history of the Cuban Revolution and the lead up to this attack. This picture is actually of the Grama, which the Cuban revolutionaries sailed over from Mexico to Cuba in. It was a replica of it. And this is really sweaty Thomas and I standing in front of the Moncada. You couldn't tell it's Moncada though because the angle of the shop wasn't very good, but we're there. That's a better one. Those are replicas of the showing the firefights and the battle that took place between the Batista's military, the dictator's military, and the Cuban revolutionaries. And the interesting thing that we learned about this museum is that it's also, in the 60s, they transformed it from a garrison into elementary school, as well as a museum for the revolution. And I know some people who've gone there in previous years, that room was actually just a classroom full of students. The other important aspect about Santiago, which was a really nice coincidence for us, is that we arrived in Santiago just as Carnaval was taking place. And in Santiago is the biggest carnival in all of Cuba. Street upon street, block upon block was full of people, full of dancers. This is one of the nights we were going out to see the floats. Basically, at night you can walk out to the street and all you can hear was the conga. And you can feel people moving just at your feet. And this is one of the billboards that is right next to one of the main squares in Santiago. The final part about Santiago that was one of the main reasons that why pastors chose to go there this year is the fact that Santiago was extremely devastated by Hurricane Sandy in October 2012. These are just some of the pictures showing the devastation that Sandy caused in less than 5 hours flowing through that country, and specifically this city. It hit other provinces, but in Santiago, it was especially severe because it's the second most populous city within the country, and the place was devastated. More than 50% of houses were smashed. More than 20,000 houses were completely obliterated. As you can see, there's trees falling all over the road. Telephone lines, electricity lines went down. The whole city was basically completely devastated by this hurricane. And this is a slide of Raul, who went and visited Santiago immediately after the hurricane to witness the damage that took place and help to organize the reconstruction. So what we did as part of the caravan is we brought humanitarian aid to Cuba and to Santiago for the hospitals, but we also took part in reconstruction efforts. This is us learning about some of the reforestation practices that Cuba's taking on, and in the city of Santiago has been taking on as well. 90% of the trees in Santiago, which was known as a city of shade, were uprooted by Sandy. So they explained about the huge leap forward that they have to make with being able to bring in trees and help reforest the city. So caravanistas had a chance to dig some holes, plant some trees, and take part of a community process to rebuild Santiago. Another thing that we were able to take part in is the reconstruction of housing. As I mentioned, 50% of houses in that city were smashed, 20,000 completely obliterated. But in the process since, they've reported that 42% of the housing issues in Santiago were repaired, they were resolved. But it's such a huge amount of work that needs to take place to continue. So this is us at one of the housing complexes digging a foundation. Some caravanistas getting their hands dirty, sweating. It was really hot when we were there. But getting involved with the Cuban construction crew, as well as the Venceremos Brigade, which was there taking part in the same project, to go along. And here we are learning about the efforts that the city has been making to rehouse all the people who've lost housing. And some caravanistas still at work. This is just 2 slides that show the creativity that is involved in reconstruction. That Cuba doesn't just see, we've got to house people, we've just got to build blocks for people to sleep in. But that this community, which was in the south of Santiago de Cuba, who had always experienced flooding, had always experienced severe conditions, was rebuilding housing for their people and for their community members. And they decided to build a cafe. In the next slide, we're going to see that they didn't just have a regular cafe built. They had a cafe built in the center of the community with the butt of a plane sticking into it. And the plane itself is a cafe where you can go and sit down. You can have waiters and waitresses come up and ask you what you want. And you're basically flying above Santiago. I've never seen this before. I don't know if I'll see it again. But it's just something that shows that out of the ordinary that they'll do to make things extraordinary for the people of Cuba. Probably the most special part of the time in Santiago was July 26th. July 26th was the 60th anniversary of the attack on the Moncada Army garrison. Every year there's a celebration, but this one was very special because it was the 60th. So the Pastors for Peace Caravanistas received a special invitation to take part in the celebration. When we got there, we woke up at 3 a.m., walked down the street, got in line, realized we were just four rows from the front. The sun rises, and the dignitaries arrive, and people start going up to the stage to speak. First of all, we noticed a guy in a Venezuelan track jacket and realized that Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, was in part of the celebration. He came from Caracas to Cuba to take part in this momentous occasion and talked about all the gains that had been made in Venezuela under Chavez and as part of the Bolivarian Revolution, and the amount of credit that the Venezuelan people owe to Cuba as part of this process, for the support and the solidarity. When he was done, he sat down, and another guy got up, a little shorter, and we realized that Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, was there. That's actually a little bit later, but Evo Morales gets up, and he starts talking. And he starts talking about the process in Bolivia, about how indigenous people have transformed their conditions in that country and against the U.S. domination of their people. Following that, dignitaries from Uruguay, presidents of Uruguay, we had people, presidents and leaders from all of the ALBA countries across the Caribbean, small islands of even 100,000 people, their presidents getting up and talking about how now they have a foundation for self-sustainability. They have engineers, they have doctors, they have citizens who've received cataract surgery. And they owe these gains and they owe what they have to what Cuba was able to provide for them. And we were sitting, the three of us were from Canada, but we're sitting with people from across the United States. And we were reflecting on how many times have we even seen Stephen Harper speak. And they were saying, yeah, I can't even get in to see my own president, let alone every single president of Latin America and across the Caribbean. It just goes to show how much Cuba and the Cuban Revolution has guided the transformation of societies and the transformation of struggle across the Western Hemisphere, to show that these leaders are all in Cuba for this day. Finally, we had the speech by Raul Castro on July 26th. He gave special mention to the caravan. He gave special mention to Lucius Walker for the years of solidarity with Cuba. It was a big honor for all of us. And he went on to talk about how the Cuban Revolution developed, the ideals of the young people. He talked about the struggles in Cuba since 1959, with a daily, hourly, and by-the-minute aggression from the United States. And he talked about the challenges today with younger generations and how many generations have grown up within the Cuban Revolution, not just before the revolution and after, but growing up as part of the revolution. And the fact that in Cuba they have confidence in the continuation of this, the continuation of the socialist ideals and of what Martí, what Fidel laid as part of the foundation of the Cuban Revolution. So As far as us being there, it was a great closing to our experience in Santiago. And I think the next clip is the three of us just totally mesmerized by the day's activities. It was quite a day. I think Thomas is going to talk a little bit more about Havana. Yeah. Okay.
Usually the caravan spends more time in Havana. This year, because of the hurricane and because of the reconstruction work, we spent more time in Santiago. But we did spend time in Havana at the University of Havana. And we did, we're going to miss the slide, but I'll just let you know that we did meet with the families of the Cuban Five. And the case of the Cuban Five is going to be explained a little bit later tonight. I'll just say there are 5 Cuban political prisoners, 4 of them still in jail in the United States. 1 of them returned to jail. 15 years they've been in jail for defending the country of Cuba against US-sponsored terrorism. It's an insane injustice. And every time we go to Cuba on the caravan, we meet with the families, we meet with their wives, who have not been able, some of them have not been able to visit their husbands for 15 years. We meet with their children who are no longer children and had to go through that whole process without their father, and who still have the rest of their lives to go and aren't living it with their families. Anyone who meets the families of the Cuban Five becomes committed to the case, and it's a really important part of the caravan. We also got some time to see some of Havana. This is the University of Havana where actually Fidel started organizing. And if you Google some pictures, there's lots of really good pictures of protests on the steps there against the Batista dictatorship. One thing I wanted to say about the caravan this year is the people that came were awesome. They were really excited to learn. They wanted to see everything. They wanted to see the good stuff. They wanted to see the challenges, and they wanted to be honest about it. And one thing that I'll tell anybody who's thinking about going to Cuba, and I think everybody here should try to go to Cuba, is that the more you give when you're in Cuba, the more you receive. The more you're trying to share yourself, the more you put yourself out there, despite language barriers, the more you'll get back. These are women from Causa Justa, which is an organization in Oakland, and they were just so pumped to be in Cuba, looking at community organizing, and because they do community organizing in Oakland on a pretty big scale, but to see what you can do when you have a whole country dedicated to community organizing, you have a whole economy based on dignity and social justice, and they're really pumped, and they took that sweet photo with Fidel up in the mountains. And this is us at 3 in the morning. Those are our invitations to go to the July 26th event. And just people, like, it didn't matter that it was 3 in the morning. People were just so pumped to be part of the program. And like I said, the caravan brings people together from all over. We've got our crew from Vancouver, from New York, from Memphis, and actually a woman studying, an American woman studying at the Latin American School of Medicine. She is from the Midwest. And we're all together there, pumped to be in Cuba, psyched about the program. And like I said, the language barrier doesn't matter in Cuba if you're willing to go there and put your heart out, and you're willing to go there and try and meet with people. 50 years, those people have been living in a society that promotes community, that promotes equality, that promotes people talking to each other on a regular basis about important things. And that makes a different kind of person. Even from the kids, you'll notice how happy they are and how important it is for them to learn and to talk with other people. I had to put this in here. This is the world's largest guayabera. There's a guayabera museum in Sancti Spiritus in Cuba. A guayabera is a traditional Cuban shirt. You might have heard about it because when the Summit of the Americas happened in Colombia a couple years ago, Obama tried to get himself made one so that he could go there and blend in. And Fidel wrote a reflection about, you're blockading our country, yet you're trying to front on this shirt that comes from our country. Nice try, buddy. So you can get a lot of famous people's guayaberas. You can see them in there. You can see Fidel's, Raul, Chavez, Alicia Alonso, famous women who had guayaberas made as well, but you will not find Obama's stupid guayabera in there. And you will find the world's largest guayabera as well. The other part of the caravan is it's been going on for 20 years. And there's people like Bill Hill who have been on every single caravan for the past 20 years and have this insane accumulation of knowledge and experience and dedication. And when you mix that with these younger people who are just hyped to be in Cuba, who are learning about social justice, a lot of the people were somewhat associated with the Occupy movement in New York, were learning about these ideas of community, and they were finally seeing them applied. And to be able to have that exchange between young and old, Bill to be able to exchange everything that he's learned, and to be able to be re-energized by these people that are really taking on the project and going forward with it. And the conversations on the bus just didn't stop. They weren't always about Cuba. They weren't always saying, oh, Cuba is great this, Cuba is great that. People were asking questions. People were trying to delve deep. But people were really, really impacted by what they were seeing. They were provoked by it. And if you go to Cuba, you will notice that for sure. Sometimes things don't go the way you plan. We have more experience with bus breakdowns on previous caravans because we take old school buses across the United States and then they're loaded to bring to Cuba. This year, the caravan was organized differently. We flew to Mexico City and then flew to Cuba, but we still managed to have a bus breakdown while in Cuba. I think it was the last day too. It was our last bus ride, but I think it was just kind of like for old time's sake, we got a bus breakdown. But everybody just got out. People started drawing, sharing poetry. I was in the shade over here. We were sharing stories that I won't repeat because there's a camera here. But the bus got fixed and we went forward, and that's what the caravan's about. Sometimes the food isn't when you want it to come. Sometimes there's not enough space. Sometimes it's really hot and you don't have enough water. But the fact that you're there for a reason, the fact that you can see people around there who are there for the same reasons, and you're moving forward together, all those kind of bumps, those hiccups, they just become tires that get fixed and you move on. And that's part of how the caravan works. I wanted to put this slideshow out there because the two women in the middle are American students who are studying medicine for free at the Latin American School of Medicine in Cuba, among many students. But we brought them to meet with Manuel Yepe, who's on the far right. He's one of the revolutionaries who's been in it from the beginning since before 1959 in the clandestine movement. He organized with Che Guevara, as well as Antonio Guerrero, who's the son of Antonio Guerrero Sr., one of the Cuban Five. And we were able to meet with them and kind of talk about the young and the old, new generation, older generation, and how they work together in the Cuban Revolution. And it was really great for us to be able to talk with them. I just wanted to, this is the poetry part, but I'll give some context. This man right here, his name is Daniel. He's a rapper from New York City. He's a Cuban-American rapper from New York City. He's the same age as me. His dad fled Cuba after the revolution. His dad actually stole a boat and blew it up and came to New York and was actually affiliated with organizations that the Cuban Five were infiltrating. So he didn't grow up in a very pro-Cuba atmosphere. He was basically forbidden to talk about it. And his father, when he told him that he was going to go to Cuba on the caravan, said, "Don't bother calling anymore. We don't have a relationship." So for him, after 31 years, to go to Cuba for the first time was a really big deal. And to see him in Cuba for the first time was a really big deal. And he was just this way, that way, trying to take it all in. And it was just really incredible to see the way that he was impacted by it. And I made reference, how many people here have seen The Godfather Part 2? Hands. Okay, we got enough people, this story is going to work. So I made reference to the part where they talk, all the mobsters are there, and they've got the cake, and they're cutting up the cake, which has Cuba on the cake, and they finally, we've got what we wanted. State help with our initiatives. And he said the same thing. But he was talking about the hip-hop initiatives that he was doing. He was talking about coordinating activities between Cuban rappers and American rappers. And he was instantly put in touch with people from the Cuban government, the Ministry of Culture, who were excited about his project. And for him to come from the United States to think about trying to ever relate to the US government on what he was doing, and finally he came to Cuba and they were so excited about what he was putting forward. And so I wrote a poem to Daniel because it was really just amazing to see what he was going through. There's some hip-hop references in here that I didn't get until I talked to him about it, and I put them in there because because I knew that he would like it. But other than that, I think that you guys will understand. There's some references to New York because a lot of people from the brigade or from the caravan were from New York. So this poem is called To Danielle. A tree grows in Santiago despite heat and hurricanes, and a tree still grows in Brooklyn, beating back bulldozers and Sandy's rains. In Havana, a tree is growing too, and in Buffalo, as Julian said, the tree of God still collects dew. They grow out of the cracked concrete, which is as figurative as it is concrete. We can tell because of where the sidewalk hits our feet, where our souls and our souls meet. No gold between us, but we've still got Cuban links, despite blockades, despite angry fathers' tirades. I'm not asking you to look at the island through rose-colored glasses, but if we understand the world in terms of masses and classes, it's from Cuba we should be taking the classes. And not the U.S. suits who should be telling us who fails and who passes. As Chavez said, they smell like sulfur, gases. Y Martí dije que yo soy un hombre sincero, de donde crecen las palmas. Y yo te dije que no somos extranjeros en este país donde crecen las almas. And now we're in the sunlight because we fight right. Right? We feel so lit up in the Santiago streetlights, talking in terms of I will instead of I might. So that's the poem. So let's move on quickly so I stop blushing. Danielle was able to collaborate with Cuban hip-hop artists that we work with in Vancouver called Obsession. Within 3 hours, they had about 3/4 of 2 songs made. And for Danielle to be able to collaborate with Cuban musicians and to express himself, and he felt so at home, was an incredible part. And that's what the caravan is part of, breaking down these blockades. It's insane. He's 31 years, he's never been able to travel to Cuba. It's insane that 330 million people, it's illegal for you guys to travel to Cuba. It's insane that Cuba, a third world country, has lost over $1 trillion because of this blockade. And that's why the caravan exists, and that's why we're going to continue to fight it. And on the caravan, you get to see a lot of things, a lot of cute Cuban kids as well. And these are the kind of kids that, if they need some specialized medicines, can't get them. And these are the kind of kids that the Cuban Revolution is fighting to protect, and the caravan is fighting to be a part of that process as well. We have a tradition in Vancouver that all our slideshows end in sunsets in Cuba. It's just kind of what we do. But I thought I was going to break the tradition this time and put this nice picture of the Cuban flag waving. There's a storm in the distance, and that's I thought it was very appropriate because the Cuban flag has flown proud and has flown strong in the face of so many storms, but it continues to fly. And there's a saying in Cuba. They say you cannot blockade hope, and you definitely cannot blockade hope. And the blockade is going to end. We are going to be part of ending the U.S. blockade on Cuba, and the caravan is an important part of that. So one last little thing. One more slide. I lied. I'm going to put a sunset in here, just for tradition's sake. We really want to thank you guys. I think we went a bit longer than we told HAP that we would be. It's hard not to go on and on about the Passage for Peace Caravan to Cuba and about Cuba in general because it is such an inspiring example. We work hard in Vancouver for the Cuban 5 against the blockade. Our work is important, but the most important work is here in the United States. You guys live in the belly of the beast. We live in kind of the intestines. The blockade has to end. U.S. people are an incredibly important part of that movement. The caravan has shown that. I want to encourage everybody. The Seattle U.S.-Cuba Friendship Association is still organizing, is still fighting for social justice to educate people about Cuba. They're doing great work, and I want to ask you guys, work with them as much as you can because they're great people and the initiative is really important. So thank you very much, everybody.
I will not celebrate Columbus. No, I will turn the other way. I will not celebrate Columbus. There is no honor on that day when the brave sea captains, so they say, set out to prove that the world was round. Yeah, but really he was looking out for gold, and he would kill for it, all for the sake of the European crown. And they found a gentle people on the shoreline, a gentle people, they could turn them into slaves, and they cut those people down just as fast as they could. They didn't even give them time to dig their own graves. And I will not celebrate Columbus. I will not give honor to his name. No, I will not celebrate Columbus. It is a day of infamy and shame, and the floodgates were opened, and history rolled, and the numbers were uncountable, the numbers were extreme, and every dead one died for a hawk's bell full of gold, discarded in the margins of the American dream. And I know it was a long time ago. I know it's hard to remember, but it's harder still to forget. Living in the shadows of a Holocaust. Maybe someday we'll organize and rise to be a threat. And I will not celebrate Columbus. No, I will not give honor to a killer and a thief. And I will not celebrate Columbus. I will not participate in absurdity's belief. Statue out by City Hall. A soldier with his uniform, his helmet, and his gun. Shivington's army at Sand Creek. Women and children, and what have they done? They have paved their paradise with money and blood. They have built their greatness on the backs of the dead. And when they stand before the gates of their rival, there will be a price on their head. And I will not celebrate Columbus. No, I will not. I will not celebrate Columbus. Let's take this upside down world and turn it over. Let's make sense of the senselessness. Let's build a house that we can all live in together. Let's clean up this mess. No, I will not celebrate Columbus. I will not celebrate Columbus. No, I will not celebrate Columbus. Columbus. Loan me a minute, let me borrow your ear. I'll sing you a song about Leonard Peltier. He's gone so long in a federal jail, the innocent victim of a tangled tale. In South Dakota where the fear was thrown, the presidents watched from a mountain of stone. They said all people were free to roam. There was a struggle for freedom in the Indian home. How many have gone before? Tell me how many more must be lost to the Indian wars. The company spoke to the high command. We need the deeds to the Indian land to dig for oil and uranium ore, and maybe have to start a little Indian war. The orders came from away on high, and it was a job for the FBI. It won't be hard, all we'll have to do is just cause a little trouble and follow it through. in Oglala where the spirit did dwell. It was a time they remember well. There were women and children gathered there. But when the wind blew a warning through the whispering air. And Leonard Peltier was one of those who came to the call when the time arose. And dangerous strangers are prowling around, bringing trouble to the reservation grounds. And that was when the agents made their play in a gunshot battle on a deadly day. And 3 men died in Lakota land, 2 FBI and an Indian man. How many have gone before? Tell me how many more must be lost to the Indian wars. Joe Stunts was a man that died that day, but the odds of the law didn't see it that way. All they cared about was their own kind. Gonna get somebody for a capital crime. The charge was set for homicide, but Leonard got away to the Canada side, where he lived for a while in the northern town, till they came up and got him and they brought him back down. The judge and the jury, they both agreed, 2 times murder in the 1st degree. They pounded the gavel and they rang on the bell, 2 times life in a federal cell. Citations came from Washington, congratulations on a job well done. 2 agents gone is a mighty price, but if you want something bad, you gotta sacrifice. They took a Leonard Peltier off away in chains, all of those years of suffering pain. Oh, but all of those years makes a warrior strong, and the struggle of the people goes on. How many have gone before? Tell me how many more must be lost to the Indian wars. And so it's been since days of old, when Custer died for a mountain of gold. But times have changed and passed him by. He's been replaced with the FBI. Oh, it's all so easy to weep and moan for a warfare fought so far from home. You can preach of peace with a righteous stand, but while they struggle for peace on the Indian land. When Joe Stunts was lower down, the winds did blow with a mighty sound. The answer came in the driving rain. This man will not have died in vain. For the hollow power of the lock and key ain't nothing to the power of the raging sea. The lightning strikes in the angry skies that puts the power into people's eyes. Oh, the weather is building to a mighty storm, and the words in the wind that come to warn are once more spoken to your ear. Only this time the name is Leonard Peltier. How many have gone before? Tell me how many more must be lost to the Indian wars. Thank you very much for having me here. My country has been stolen and I ain't lying down. I'm gonna make a lot of noise. I'm gonna spread it all around. I will not be the meek one, sit back and bite my tongue. I dare somebody tell me not to sing this song. Cause these are some big words that we all learn in school. Words to build a country by or give notice to a fool. I took the liberty to rhyme them all, the easier to sing. Maybe it'll help to make the pendulum swing. Cause this is my declaration, your declaration too. So let's live up to it, see what we can do. Let's go see what we can do. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and that means that everyone can see that we are all created equal. And that means that you are just like me, with certain unalienable rights. And that means that they are ours to keep, like a life, liberty, and happiness. It's going to make you want to weep. Now, to secure these rights, we institute our governments. They get the powers from us. They govern by our consent, and should any one of them become destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish them. Yes, this is my declaration, your declaration too. So let's live up to it, see what we can do. Let's go see what we can do. When in the course of human events, the time has finally come, beware you bandit government, your race is almost run. These words were written more than 200 years ago. Catching up with history, it moves so slow, it moves so slow. Governments should not be changed for light or transient cause. But when abuse and usurpations become the rule of law, it is the right, it is the duty of the people to respond. To throw off such a government and move on, move on. Yes, this is my declaration, your declaration too. So let's live up to it, see what we can do. Yes, this is my declaration, your declaration too. So let's live up to it, see what we can do. Let's go see what we can do.